The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, carried up the servant's stair before the household had even finished its breakfast, and set down beside Lady Cassandra Hale's plate without a word of explanation. It bore no crest, no wax seal, dark and formal, the way such things were meant to arrive in a house like Ashenmore. Only her name, written in a hand she recognized at once as the Duke's own steward, and beneath it, a single line that would have meant nothing to anyone else in the world, and meant everything to her. The hillside is yours. His Grace wishes you good fortune with it. She sat very still for a long moment, the letter trembling faintly in her fingers, while around her the breakfast room carried on exactly as it always did, the clink of porcelain, the low murmur of her cousin's idle gossip, the fire settling in the grate. No one else in that room understood what those words truly meant. No one else understood that she had just been given, with a smile she could still picture with perfect clarity, the one piece of land in the entire county that everyone agreed was worthless. She did not know then that within 2 years, every landowner from Ashenmore to the coast would be trying, quietly and then not so quietly, to buy that same worthless hillside back from her. Before I take you further into how a barren, forgotten patch of land became the most sought-after property in the county, and what it cost Lady Cassandra Hale to hold on to it, I want to ask something of you. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this one, stories of underestimated women who turn a powerful man's contempt into their own quiet triumph, then please take a moment now to subscribe to this channel so these stories keep finding you. And I'd genuinely love to know who's listening tonight. Leave a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. It always amazes me how far these old English stories travel, and I read every single comment. Now, let us go back to the morning that Hillside was given away, and to the Duke who believed he was ridding himself of a problem rather than creating one. To understand why the Duke of Merrow gave away land no sane man wanted, one must first understand what Lady Cassandra Hale had become to him, not a niece to be provided for, but an inconvenience to be quietly resolved. She was 24, unmarried, and, by the standards of the county's drawing rooms, increasingly unmarriageable. Her father, the Duke's younger brother, had died when she was a girl of 12, leaving her in the guardianship of an uncle who had never particularly wanted the responsibility, and a modest trust that had shrunk, year by year, under the careless management of men who assumed she would never think to question them. She was not without prospects, exactly. She was clever. Too clever, some said. For a woman expected to smile prettily at dinner and defer to whichever gentleman held the floor. She read more than was considered proper. She asked questions at the wrong moments. And she had, on more than one occasion, embarrassed a suitor by knowing more about crop rotation and land value than he did, which was, in the estimation of Ashenmore society, no way at all for a lady to secure a husband. By the time she reached her 24th year, the Duke had grown tired of the whispers that followed her, tired of relatives asking pointedly when she might finally be settled, tired of a niece who seemed to have no interest in being settled at all. And so, when she came to him that winter and asked, with more boldness than he expected, for some small portion of land of her own, enough to grant her a measure of independence, a household she might run without waiting on anyone's permission, he had seen, in that request, a convenient solution to a problem he had been quietly hoping would simply go away. She did not know then that his generosity was not generosity at all, but a calculated dismissal, a way of appearing to provide for her while ensuring she would trouble him no further. The hillside beyond Thornridge, he had said, barely looking up from his correspondence. Take it, if you're so determined to have land of your own. No one else has found use for it in 30 years. It should suit your independent temperament rather well. There had been laughter in his voice. Not cruel, exactly. The Duke was rarely cruel outright, but the particular, dismissive amusement of a man certain he had solved a problem cheaply. Thorn Ridge was barren rock and thin, wind-scoured soil, useless for farming, too steep for grazing, too far from the main roads to be worth developing. 3 separate tenants had refused it outright over the decades rather than pay rent on land that yielded nothing. Cassandra had accepted anyway. She did not know then, could not have known, that the very worthlessness of that hillside was about to become the reason everyone wanted it. The cottage on Thorn Ridge, when she first arrived to claim it, was barely fit to be called a dwelling at all. It had belonged, decades before, to a shepherd who had abandoned the post entirely rather than continue grazing sheep on ground too poor to sustain them. The roof had partially caved. The single hearth was choked with the nests of birds who had long ago decided the place belonged to them rather than to any human tenant. The wind came through gaps in the stone walls with a sound that, on her first night there, kept Cassandra awake until dawn, wondering, not for the first time, whether pride had led her into a decision far graver than she'd understood. Society did not receive her decision kindly. A lady, living alone, on land not even worth farming it was, by the standards of Ashenmoor's drawing rooms. Close to scandal. Invitations grew thinner. Her aunt stopped calling altogether, embarrassed, she said plainly, by a niece who had chosen eccentric poverty over sensible marriage. Even the servants who had once tended her modest townhouse rooms regarded her departure to Thorn Ridge with the particular pity reserved for those believed to have thrown away their last real chance. She did not know then that this very isolation, the thing society pitied her for most, would become the quiet advantage no one else in the county possessed. The journey to Thornfield took the better part of 2 days, and Isabel spent much of it composing and abandoning, in equal measure, the various speeches she imagined herself delivering to whichever member of the family finally received her. She arrived, in the end, saying almost nothing at all, ushered not to the great house itself, but directly to the small, weathered gatehouse at the estate's furthest boundary, where an elderly steward named Mr. Price awaited her with an expression that suggested he found the entire arrangement as puzzling as she did. "His Grace sends his regrets that he could not receive you personally," Price said, though his tone carried little conviction that any genuine regret existed on the Duke's part. "He asks only that you keep the gatehouse in reasonable order and that you make no particular effort to trouble the household at the main house regarding matters that do not concern you." "And the bridge?" Isabel asked, glancing toward the collapsed stone structure visible beyond the gatehouse's small garden, its central span fallen entirely into the river below. Weeds and moss claiming what remained of its ancient arches. "Fallen these past 6 years, miss. Cost more to repair than His Grace has ever judged it worth, given how few travellers this road sees now that the main crossing further south serves most purposes well enough. I shouldn't trouble yourself over it, if I were you. No one else has." Isabel studied the ruined bridge for a long moment, understanding, with a clarity that surprised her, precisely why it had been chosen for her exile. It was not merely distant from the house, it was a symbol, whether the Duke had intended it consciously or not, of exactly the kind of quiet, permanent neglect he wished to extend toward her. Visible enough that no one could claim she had been entirely abandoned, but broken and forgotten enough that no one would ever expect anything worthwhile to come of the arrangement. She did not yet know that the bridge's collapse held secrets considerably more complicated than simple neglect, or that untangling those secrets would eventually lead her back to the very accusation that had exiled her from Thornfield 8 years before. She met the Duke himself only 3 days after her arrival, and not, as she had half expected, by any deliberate summons on his part. She encountered him instead at the boundary between the gatehouse grounds and the wider estate, where she had gone walking in the late afternoon light, still unsettled by the strange, hollow quiet of a house she had once, briefly, called home. He did not recognize her at first, 8 years and considerable change had passed since she had last stood before him. Herself scarcely more than a girl at the time, and his own memory of that distant cousin's disgrace had clearly grown vague with disuse. It was only when she gave her name, watching his expression shift from polite confusion to something considerably more guarded, that he understood precisely whom he addressed. "Miss Merrow," he said finally, "I had not expected to encounter you so directly. Your solicitor's letter did not specify that I should avoid the grounds entirely, Your Grace, merely that I should not trouble the household. I confess I did not realize a simple walk constituted trouble." Something flickered across his face, not quite amusement, though close enough to it that Isabel found herself, despite everything, briefly unsettled by the resemblance to warmth. "No," he admitted, "I suppose it doesn't." He did not linger in conversation, offering only a brief, formal inquiry into whether the gatehouse suited her needs before continuing on whatever business had originally brought him to that corner of the estate. But Isabel noticed, watching him go, that his gaze had drifted, more than once during their brief exchange, toward the collapsed bridge beyond the gatehouse garden, a look that carried something considerably more complicated than the simple indifference Mr. Price's account had suggested. She did not yet understand what that look meant, or why a bridge the Duke claimed not worth the cost of repair should draw his attention with such evident, unwilling weight. That understanding would come only gradually, over the weeks that followed, as she began, almost despite herself, to take a genuine interest in the ruin she had been sent to quietly ignore. Isabel's first weeks at the gatehouse passed in the particular quiet rhythm of a woman rebuilding, once again, a life reduced to its barest essentials. She kept the small cottage in careful order, tended the modest garden Price's predecessor had apparently once maintained with more enthusiasm than the current steward troubled himself with, and found, in the solitude of that remote corner of the estate, a peace she had not expected to feel so soon after her return to a place that had once caused her such profound humiliation. It was the bridge itself, in the end, that drew her attention most persistently, not out of any particular ambition, at first, but simply because it stood so constantly within view of the gatehouse's small windows. A daily reminder of ruin that gradually, over those first quiet weeks, began to feel less like an accident of geography and more like a puzzle she had not yet fully understood. She began walking its length in the early mornings, when mist still clung to the river below, studying the pattern of its collapse with the careful attention she had once applied, as a girl, to her father's rare stories of the estate's history. The central span had fallen cleanly, she noted, in a manner that struck her, the more closely she examined it, as somewhat peculiar for a structure claimed to have simply succumbed to age and neglect. The stonework at the break showed signs, faint but unmistakable to a careful eye, of deliberate weakening rather than gradual decay. Chisel marks along certain load-bearing points that no natural erosion could easily explain. She mentioned this observation to no one at first, uncertain whether her own suspicion reflected genuine discovery or simply the restless imagination of a woman with too much solitary time and too many old grievances still unresolved. But the observation lodged itself in her mind regardless, refusing to be dismissed, and she found herself returning to the bridge again and again over the following weeks, gathering small details that gradually, piece by piece, began to suggest a history considerably more deliberate than simple accident. If Isabel's story is pulling you in the way it pulled me in while writing it, this is only the beginning of what's hidden beneath that collapsed bridge. Make sure you're subscribed, because what she uncovers next connects directly back to the very accusation that exiled her from Thornfield 8 years ago. And I still want to hear from you. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love watching this map fill up with all of you listening from around the world. The first true clue arrived not from the bridge itself, but from an elderly woman named Mrs. Tillett, who kept a small cottage near the ruined crossing, and who had lived, by her own account, within sight of that bridge for the better part of 60 years. Fell strange, that bridge did, Mrs. Tillett said one afternoon, when Isabel had stopped to exchange the particular quiet courtesies neighbours extend in remote corners of large estates. I remember the night well enough, though I was younger then and thought little of it beyond the noise. Autumn storm, they said, weakened the old stonework, past bearing, that I recall, clear as anything, seeing lantern light along the bridge itself the evening before its collapse, men working at something in the dark, though I couldn't rightly say what, and no one ever spoke of repairs being carried out that night, before or since. Do you remember who the men were, Mrs. Tillett? The old woman considered the question with the particular slowness of memory reaching far back into years grown thin. Estate men, I always assumed, though I couldn't swear to faces at that distance an hour. There was talk, for a time, that the old Duke himself, the current one's father, that would be, had ordered the bridge weakened deliberately, though I never understood why anyone would trouble themselves to ruin a perfectly serviceable crossing. The talk died down soon enough, the way such things do, and I confess I'd nearly forgotten it myself until you asked. Isabel thanked Mrs. Tillett and continued her walk with her mind considerably more unsettled than before. A bridge deliberately weakened, on the very estate where she had once been falsely accused of theft, in the years surrounding what she now understood, with growing unease, might not have been entirely separate incidents after all. She did not yet see the full shape of the connection. But she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from patient, careful observation, that Thornfield's quiet corners held considerably more secrets than the great house's polished public rooms had ever troubled themselves to reveal. It was in the gatehouse itself, some weeks later, that Isabel found the discovery that finally began to connect the bridge's suspicious collapse to her own long-buried disgrace. She had been clearing a small, disused storage room at the cottage's rear, unused, by all appearances, for years beyond counting, when she discovered, tucked behind a loose panel in the room's old wooden wall, a small collection of papers that had clearly been hidden there deliberately and left undisturbed since. They belonged, she understood almost immediately from the careful, familiar handwriting, to the gatehouse's previous occupant, a woman named Sarah Loft, who had served, Isabel gathered from the papers themselves, as companion to the old Duchess during the very years surrounding Isabel's own disgrace and exile. The papers were not a formal journal, but a series of private notes, seemingly written for no audience beyond the author's own troubled conscience. They described, in increasingly anxious detail, a growing suspicion that the old Duchess's missing brooch, the very item whose disappearance had condemned Isabel 8 years before, had never truly been stolen at all, but had instead been deliberately planted among Isabel's belongings by someone within the household determined to see the young girl removed from Thornfield entirely. I do not know who bears the true blame, one entry read, in handwriting grown visibly unsteady with the weight of what it described, though I have my suspicions I dare not commit fully to paper, even here, where I trust no eyes but my own will ever fall upon these words. The girl wept most piteously, protesting her innocence with a conviction I confess troubled me greatly at the time, though I said nothing, coward that I was, fearing what speaking against the old Duchess's certainty might cost my own modest position in this household. Isabel read that entry 3 times before she trusted herself to fully understand its weight. She had not imagined her own innocence, all those years of quiet, private certainty against a household's collective condemnation. Someone at Thornfield had deliberately engineered her disgrace, for reasons the old companion's guilty notes did not yet fully explain. She did not yet understand what connection, if any, existed between her own false accusation and the bridge's suspicious collapse, both occurring within the same troubled years of Thornfield's history. That connection, she suspected, lay buried somewhere deeper still in the estate's guarded past. The connection revealed itself gradually, over the following weeks, through a combination of careful observation and the reluctant, piecemeal cooperation of servants who had, Isabel came to understand, spent years maintaining a careful silence about matters they privately found deeply troubling. It was Mr. Price himself, growing gradually more sympathetic to Isabel's quiet, persistent questions, who finally offered the piece that connected every earlier thread. He confided, one grey afternoon, as they walked the boundary near the ruined bridge, that the current Duke's own father had harboured, in his final years, a growing and increasingly desperate fear that Isabel's own father, his younger brother, had left behind, before his early death. Documentation proving an inheritance claim considerably stronger than the family had ever publicly acknowledged. There was talk, among the older servants when I first came to this position, that your father held papers proving Thornfield's succession ought properly to have passed differently than it did, some old entailment matter. Complicated enough that I confess I never fully understood the particulars myself. The old Duke feared, I believe, that such papers might one day surface and unsettle his own son's inheritance. And the bridge? Price's expression grew carefully guarded. The bridge crossed toward the old parish records office, Miss, in the village 3 miles distant, where such entailment papers would have been formally recorded and preserved. I cannot say with certainty that its collapse was connected to your father's claim, but I confess the timing has always struck me as considerably more convenient than simple accident usually allows. Isabel understood, in that moment, the full shape of what had happened to her 8 years before. She had not been exiled from Thornfield merely out of simple family coldness or dislike. She had been deliberately, calculatedly removed, her reputation destroyed through a planted accusation, precisely because her continued presence at Thornfield and her father's buried claim threatened an inheritance the old Duke had determined, by whatever means necessary, to protect for his own son. The bridge's collapse, she now understood, had likely served the same desperate purpose, severing, however temporarily, the most direct route to records that might have proven her father's claim, buying the old Duke time to ensure whatever documentation existed was quietly, permanently suppressed before anyone thought to seek it out. Before we see what Isabel does with this discovery, I need to ask you again, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment, because what happens next is the reason this story exists at all. And for those of you who've already told me where you're watching from, thank you. For anyone who hasn't yet, the comments are still open, and I truly do read every single one. Isabel brought her discoveries to the current Duke with considerably more caution than her earlier certainty might have suggested, understanding that whatever role his own father had played in her disgrace, the current Duke himself had inherited a position built, at least in part, upon a foundation of deliberate deception he might not have personally constructed, but had certainly, comfortably, benefited from ever since. She laid before him, in the same small study where he had once offered her only the barest formal courtesy, Sarah Loft's guilty private notes, Mrs. Tillet's account of lantern light along the bridge the night before its collapse, and Mr. Price's careful, reluctant testimony regarding her father's suppressed inheritance claim. He read through each piece in silence, his expression growing increasingly troubled, until finally he set the papers down and looked at her with something that might, in a less guarded man, have been genuine distress. "My own father," he said quietly, "engineered your disgrace and quite possibly destroyed a bridge, to protect an inheritance that may never have rightfully belonged to either of us at all. I cannot yet prove the full extent of it, Your Grace, but the pattern is difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence, however much I suspect you might wish to." He did not argue the point, though Isabel watched him wrestle, visibly, with the full weight of what her discoveries implied. Not merely a private family cruelty, but a question that might, if properly proven, unsettle the very inheritance he had spent his entire adult life assuming was rightfully, uncomplicatedly his own. "What do you intend to do with this?" he asked finally. "I intend, Your Grace, to see the truth properly established, whatever it ultimately proves. I do not seek to unseat you from a title I have no particular ambition to claim for myself. I seek only what should have been extended to me 8 years ago, and was instead deliberately, cruelly withheld, an honest accounting of what actually happened, rather than the convenient lie your family has maintained ever since." The search for her father's original documentation consumed the better part of the following month, conducted with a thoroughness that surprised even Isabel herself, who had not expected the Duke's own resources to be extended so readily toward uncovering a truth that might yet complicate his own position considerably. They found, eventually, in the parish records office the bridge's collapse had once made so difficult to reach, exactly what Price's careful account had suggested: formal documentation, decades old but still legally valid, establishing that Isabel's father had indeed held a claim to Thornfield's succession that the family's later arrangements had quietly, deliberately overlooked. The claim, once properly examined by solicitors the Duke himself engaged for the purpose, proved considerably more limited in its practical effect than the old Duke's evident panic might have suggested. A matter, in the end, more easily resolved through formal acknowledgement and modest financial settlement than any true unseating of the current Duke's position. But the acknowledgement itself mattered enormously to Isabel, in ways she had not fully anticipated until the solicitor's formal letter finally arrived, confirming in careful legal language what she had known, privately and without proof, for the better part of 8 years, that she had been wronged, deliberately and calculatedly, by a family determined to protect its own comfortable fiction at whatever cost her own reputation required. What followed the truth's full establishment was not a dramatic public reckoning, but something slower and, in its own quiet way, considerably more meaningful. The Duke saw to it that Isabel's name was formally, properly cleared among the county's solicitors and record-keepers. The old theft accusation officially struck from whatever informal record had followed her these 8 years. He offered, too, a settlement considerably beyond what the modest legal claim alone required, in acknowledgement of what his own father's deception had cost her. Isabel accepted only what fairness genuinely demanded, declining the more generous portions of his offer with a quiet firmness that seemed, if anything, to increase rather than diminish the Duke's evident respect for her. What she asked for instead, when he pressed her to name some further recompense, was considerably simpler and considerably more meaningful to the life she had begun. Almost without noticing, to build for herself at Thornfield's quiet eastern boundary. She asked that the bridge be properly restored. The restoration began that same autumn, funded generously from the estate's own resources and directed, at Isabel's insistence, according to plans that would ensure the crossing served the surrounding villages properly for generations to come, rather than simply patching over whatever damage the original sabotage had caused. She worked alongside the estate's masons and engineers with a genuine growing interest in the project's progress, understanding, as the new stonework gradually rose to replace what deliberate cruelty had once destroyed, that she was rebuilding considerably more than a simple river crossing. Mrs. Tillett, who had first offered the crucial memory of lantern light along the doomed bridge, lived nearby enough to watch the restoration's progress from her own cottage window, and she took evident, quiet satisfaction in seeing the crossing finally repaired after so many years of neglect. "I always thought it a shame," she told Isabel, watching the new central span slowly take shape above the river, seeing good stonework left to ruin over whatever old grievance caused it. "Glad I am to see it mended, whatever the true story behind its falling." By the time winter's first frost arrived, the bridge stood whole again for the first time in 6 years, solid, properly engineered, considerably sturdier than the original structure, whatever deliberate weakness had once compromised it. Isabel stood at its centre, on the morning of its formal reopening, watching the first travellers in years cross the River Thorn without the long, difficult detour the ford had required, and felt something settle within her that she had not expected to feel so completely. Not merely vindication, though vindication mattered considerably, but the particular satisfaction of having built something genuinely useful from ground everyone else had long since abandoned as hopeless. Word of the restored bridge travelled through the surrounding villages with the particular speed reserved for genuinely useful news. Travellers who had for years taken the longer route through the treacherous ford began, within weeks, favouring the newly restored crossing instead, and by the following spring, the bridge saw traffic from 3 separate villages that had once relied entirely on the more distant, more dangerous route. Merchants found the restored crossing considerably more efficient for moving goods between markets that had previously required a full day's additional travel to properly connect. Families separated by the river's difficult crossing found themselves able, for the first time in 6 years, to visit relations and attend markets without the exhausting detour the ford had demanded. The gatehouse itself, once intended as Isabel's quiet place of exile, became instead a natural gathering point for travellers pausing before or after their crossing, and Isabel found herself, almost without quite intending it, extending the same modest hospitality to strangers that her aunt had once extended to her in Fenbridge. Miss Price, whose careful, reluctant testimony had first connected the bridge's collapse to Isabel's own false accusation, remained steward at Thornfield for several years following the restoration, taking evident pride in a crossing he had once dismissed as not worth the estate's trouble to repair. He confided to Isabel, more than once in those following years, that he considered the bridge's restoration among the finest achievements he had witnessed in his considerable years of service to the estate. Sarah Loft's guilty conscience, preserved in those hidden papers for so many years, finally found its rest when Isabel arranged through careful inquiry to locate the woman's own surviving family and share with them the truth her private notes had helped uncover. They received the confirmation with evident relief, having apparently wondered for years what troubled conscience had driven their own relation to leave Thornfield's service so abruptly, decades before, without ever fully explaining her reasons. The Duke himself came to walk the restored bridge often, in the months and years that followed its reopening, not merely as a landlord surveying estate improvements, but as something closer to a genuine witness to what patient, careful truth-seeking could ultimately accomplish, even against the deliberate deceptions his own family had constructed and maintained for the better part of a decade. He never fully absolved himself of his father's cruelty toward her, whatever formal acknowledgement and settlement he had offered, but his continued presence at the bridge's edge, watching travellers cross where deliberate sabotage had once ensured only isolation, became its own quiet kind of ongoing amends, offered in the only language a man raised to guarded, careful authority truly seemed to know. Isabel Merrow never forgot the letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning, offering her a ruin she was meant to quietly accept and disappear into. She came, in time, to think of that letter not as the final confirmation of her family's rejection, but as the beginning of the only true justice she had ever truly been owed. Not simply a formal clearing of her name, though that mattered enormously, but the deeper, more lasting satisfaction of watching something genuinely useful rise from ground everyone else had long since abandoned as worthless. Years later, when people in the county spoke of the remarkable Thornfield crossing, they rarely remembered the collapsed stonework it had once been, or the quiet exile it was originally intended to enforce. They remembered instead the steady flow of travellers from 3 villages, the merchants who found their journeys shortened by half a day's difficult travel, the families reunited by a crossing that deliberate cruelty had once tried permanently to sever. But those who knew the fuller story, the letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning, the hidden papers behind a loose panel, the old companion's guilty conscience finally laid to rest, understood that the bridge itself was never truly the point. It was proof. Proof that a ruin chosen specifically to keep someone quietly out of sight could become, through patience and persistence enough, the very thing that finally brought her back into full view. Proof that a family's carefully maintained lie, however deeply buried, could still be traced back to its true and deliberate origin by anyone determined enough to keep asking the questions everyone else had long since stopped bothering to raise. And proof, most of all, that the people so easily dismissed and quietly exiled are often the very ones who go on to build the bridges, quite literally. In Isabel's case, that connect what deliberate cruelty once tried permanently to keep apart